Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Lives, your weekly podcast where we talk about everything you need to know when you're over the age of 40. Now, this week we are very lucky to be joined by another Vicky, and Vicky is the owner of Pocket Rockets Cleaning Service. Now, it's not just regular cleans that you do, is it, Vicky? You do what I would consider to be quite extreme cleans. So you work with local authorities, you work with families in cases of hoarding, and also you work with around unattended deaths. We're not going to cover that in this episode, but you are going to come back and do another episode with us where we cover that. Vicky, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How did you get into this? This is quite unusual for anyone to do.
It
How
is
did
a
you
bit
get
niche,
started?
yeah. So initially, when I started the business, we solely did regular domestic cleaning. That was 7 years ago. It happened a little bit by accident. I was at a bit of a crossroads with another business, and my daughter had just started school, and I found myself with a little bit of extra time. And I kind of felt like until I decided what I wanted to do, I would set up a cleaning business just locally, because I like cleaning, and it was as simple as that. But very quickly, I was fully booked. I started to take a team on, and it did just escalate. And it remained a domestic cleaning service right up until COVID times, and obviously, like a lot of other businesses, we were shut down overnight. We weren't allowed inside people's homes. And even when the domestic cleaning industry did start to slowly open back up, it did probably take us about 18 months to 2 years to fully recover from that, because people were still isolating, people were still working from home, people were off school, like kids off school, so they didn't have childcare. And it made me realise that the sort of foolproof, secure business that I thought I had actually wasn't. And I needed to make some changes so that, heaven forbid, if we did ever go into a pandemic or lockdown situation again, our service would be classed as essential, the more specialist cleaning. And actually, I can do decontamination, outbreak, sort of COVID type fogging now as well. So actually, we would be quite busy if that ever happened. But certainly the crime scenes, the extreme cleaning, the unattended deaths, etc., would still be seen as an essential service. So that was why we diversified. And I did the crime scene cleaning course, nearly 3 years ago now.
Okay. So on this channel, on this podcast, we cover many things, and particularly around caring for elderly parents or caring for somebody with disabilities or indeed mental health conditions. Now, I know hoarding is quite a significant issue for more people than you would think, but you go in and deal with that on quite a regular basis, don't you? Sort of dealing with the hoarding is. And I also know from our previous conversations that you've actually done courses around mental health as well. So it's not just you go in and rip people's belongings out. There's a deep understanding of the root causes of hoarding. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So the first ever hoarding job that we got, I think I was completely naive. I thought that it was quite rare. I think you see the documentaries on telly and you think it's so shocking it can't possibly be a common problem. But I realised quite quickly that it is unfortunately quite common. And I don't think like the pandemic's helped that either. A lot of people have kind of developed more sort of those issues since the pandemic. And I realised quite quickly that, like, as you say, just going in and sort of cleaning somebody up without much understanding of their circumstances and having a bit of a sort of depth of knowledge as to what might sort of be happening to create those circumstances, it's not what they need. So yes, I've put myself through some mental health qualifications and some hoarding specific qualifications to give myself a better understanding, but also to make me better at my job, and I can give that knowledge to the team. And we take more of a holistic approach. We work quite closely with authorities as what they would call like a multi-agency intervention. But it's, as you say, it's not just going in and clearing them out. That's very traumatic. So we have to be, tread very carefully, very delicately. So just for us to understand that a little bit better, it's better for everybody. So.
Now, how common is hoarding? Obviously, I'm sure you encounter it more than the regular sort of
Yeah.
everyday person who has no. I know working in social care, hoarding is something that we come across very, very often. It can often be an indicator of somebody who's quite poorly. It can creep up on people as well. It's not all of a sudden one day the house is filled with things. It happens over periods of time. But it's also something people don't feel very comfortable broaching with their loved ones
Yeah.
necessarily. How often do you see hoarding, and how big a problem do you think that it is?
It's a huge problem. We see it. I mean, we get referrals weekly. We don't do every single job that we go to quote or we go to assess. It completely depends on every individual circumstances and cost, and there's other factors. Sometimes they don't actually want the work done. They might get we might get a referral from social services, but fundamentally they don't want the work done. And as you say, quite often families are involved as well, and it's really, really hard for families, because if your loved one is hoarding, it's obvious to somebody from the outside that it's not safe, it's not clean. Sometimes there's a vast sort of fire risk or severe hygiene implications. And if it's your mum or auntie or, father-in-law, whoever it is, and you care about them so much and you just want to go in and help, and that's natural to want to do that. But actually, most of the time, people find it quite violating. They are happy to live like that, and I use inverted commas with that, because they are not. It is always a mental health issue. It's very complex, and it's different triggers and different severities and different circumstances. But nobody is living like that in a sound mind. And as you say, sometimes it's happened so gradually they don't necessarily realise it's got so bad or see the severity. And from an outsider looking in, it's shocking, it's dangerous, it's they can't fathom. But to them, it's their home, it's their things. They've created that environment for themselves. It's their safety net. And when people start, as far as they're concerned, interfering, trying to get involved, they find it, I say, it's quite violating. And sometimes, quite often, it will lead to fractured relationships in families, and they isolate themselves further because they don't want anybody getting involved. And as a sort of family member or a loved one that really cares about the person, that can be so hard, very frustrating, but also very worrying. And there's a lot of guilt involved, and it's just not an easy circumstance for anybody involved, really.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point you made about safety as well, because there is a huge, when we talk about hoarding, I know people, and I, as anyone who listens to this knows me, I collect what other people might consider to be junk. I've got a diver's helmet in my living room. I collect objects of interest to me.
Yeah.
But there's a vast difference between being messy, being a collector, and hoarding. Are you able to sort of differentiate? We know in social care we use a scale.
Yes, there is a scale.
There is a scale.
Yeah.
But for me, it's around when it becomes dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. So, as you say, sometimes people just like a lot of things. And if it's an elderly person, they might have a lifetime of things that they've collected over the years. My grandparents' house was full of antiques, and my grandma collected teapots. There was teapots on every surface, but they weren't hoarders. It is different. And I think when it becomes unsafe, so we're talking about things like, is it a fire risk? So quite common, people will hoard things that are flammable. So a lot of newspaper, a lot of junk mail, post, paperwork. They'll keep Christmas cards for decades, but piles of them. Yeah. And it gets to the point where there is such a large volume, it's a fire risk, and not just in terms of the flammable material, but quite often, and you'll have seen these on the TV, severe cases, there's sometimes very little access in and out of rooms. They might have created a tiny little tunnel to walk through. Sometimes there's not even that. I've done hoarder properties before where I've had to climb into the rooms because it's sort of floor to ceiling, the door's blocked up, you have to pick your way in, you climb over to just access the room. So if there was a fire, can somebody get out easily? Can the fire brigade get in easily? So that's always, a huge factor. And then there's also the risk of crushing. You know, if you've got floor to ceiling anything, whatever it is, even if it is newspapers or whatever, when it's or clothing, it doesn't necessarily, each individual item doesn't necessarily need to be heavy, but when there's the sheer volume, and you know, you're piling things up, things become unsteady, you know. And again, quite often people have got physical health issues, or they might be elderly, so their mobility is not great, so they might be a bit wobbly or a bit shuffly. They've got a tiny little passage to walk through and they were a bit wobbly. It's so easy for things to fall onto them, or they could fall over and things land on top of them, and they could actually literally be buried underneath. So,
and then again, then it's access for the ambulance service to get in.
Exactly. Sometimes you can't even open the front door. Paramedics can't physically get in because the front door's blocked up, or, you know, it's so common. And then there's that, obviously, the hygiene risks as well. Is another safety sort of health issue. Quite often these places might have
is there an element for anyone who's listening, if we're looking at harm reduction, because we know it's difficult to get someone to accept that they need help around hoarding. It's huge, and as you said before, it can feel quite confronting and invasive to people. We come across that an awful lot. But actually, there's a tack that we can take, and we use this sometimes as well, is around harm reduction. Okay, so we're not going to get rid of your stuff, but what we are going to do is try to make things safer as a first step. So it is about having the correct, you know, accessible pathways, being able to open the front door. And it sounds like it doesn't sound like you're doing enough, but sometimes it's the beginning, it's that step towards actually getting the sort of correct amount of help. What sort of things do people hoard? Because I know that you have there's urine is one of them that I know on your page that crops up quite a lot.
Yeah, human waste is a thing that people hoard. It depends. Again, every circumstance is completely different. Some people do have a specific thing that they tend to hoard. It might be newspapers or you know, clothing or something like that. Quite often it gets to such a severe sort of point where they're hoarding everything. They just won't throw anything away, and that could be, you know, to what is obvious to us. It could be, you know, rubbish, rotten food, you know, out of date food. They could have. It's very, very common that hoarders have rotten food and sort of milk bottles out all over the kitchen, but it's from sometimes years, so it's all very rotten, and there's flies. And again, I say human waste. A lot of people do hoard their own human waste, and you can't get your head around what could possibly be going through someone's mind to think that it's normal to, you know, hoard their own urine or their own feces, but they're not in sound mind, and it's an emotional attachment to anything, and it's a control thing, and they just don't want to throw anything away. But yeah, that it's not uncommon for there to be like a significant level of you know, dirt and unsanitary things because they just won't throw anything away. We went to one house and the lady had such a bad rat and mice infestation. They were running around everywhere. We had them sort of running at us while we were trying to clear. She was feeding them. She wasn't bothered at all. She was like giving them like bits of bread and bits of cook. She'd almost developed a relationship with the rats and with the mice that were ruining her house. Everything was completely ruined.
But they didn't judge you though, did they?
Chewing through everything. They'd chewed through the boiler. They'd chewed through pipes. You know, the damage was unreal. But to her, she didn't want to get rid of them. She didn't want to get rid of cobwebs. She didn't want to get rid of her own human waste. It was just the compulsion to keep hold of everything was so real.
And how long did that clean take you?
So we did that over a course of sort of 2 or 3 months in phases. There was an issue where they'd had a leak in the kitchen. So instead of getting a plumber around, because the kitchen was so full, the plumber wouldn't have been able to access the pipes. They just turned the water off. So they didn't have running water for 2 years. So we needed to clear the house so that the plumber could go in to fix the water and turn the water back on, fix the pipes, get the boiler working again, because rats had chewed through all the boiler and everything, and they couldn't access the boiler either. That was in a different room. And then we had to wait until the water was back on to go back and clean it. So I think we went 11 times on 11 separate occasions, but it was over a couple of months. And we were taking a team of 2 to 4 people each time we went. So the labour alone on that was like colossal man hours.
Yeah.
It's just so time consuming.
Would this lady have filled things back up when you'd left? Was it almost like you were sort of going back, or were things remaining largely the same? Or
she didn't have a massive amount of time between each visit. There was maybe a week or 2 between each visit. So, but she had started to sort of bring things back in, and the circumstances were she was sort of being forced to have the work done because it had got so bad that it was an environmental health issue, and she wasn't given a choice, which is always really sad because it's very traumatic for them. So it was, I feel like this was over a year ago now. I would be very, very surprised if I went back and it was as we left it. I'm sure she will have started to, it's a self-sabotage thing. The thing is, if we go in and we do the clearance and the clean and give them a reset, but actually unless they have the help with an ongoing support with the actual issues that they've got, it's like sticking a sticky plaster over a severed artery. You're not actually dealing with the issue. So, and there is help and support available, but not everybody wants it. And again, you can't force people to go into therapy or accept the support.
No. Do you ever get called back to repeat cleans?
We have done. Yeah, we have on occasions. Yeah.
And again, I think it's exactly as you said, is there is an underlying issue. And I know, and I read some of the comments, I follow you on TikTok. I think the work you do is so fascinating. I have to say this, though, you have a much stronger stomach than I do, because even some of the videos you put up, not for me.
Yeah.
But I think we can sort of cure the symptom, but unless the underlying cause is dealt with, then you're just almost doing that reset, and it's a matter of time then before people go back. Do you know what? So if we're looking at the people who are listening today, and they might have people they think may be beginning to hoard. Do you have any tips on how we could start a conversation with somebody about perhaps there's a lot of stuff here? What do we do next? Is there any advice that you could give around that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the circumstances and the relationship, and when you sort of try to tackle it. I get sort of intervening quite early is key. So I feel like if the problem's already escalated, just from my own experience, it tends to be harder to sort of intervene. Whereas actually, as you say, if it's just getting a bit busy and there's a lot of clutter around, you could sort of, if it's a loved one, a parent, and a relative, etc. There are ways and means, as you say, or maybe like boxing a few things up to pop in the attic. Do they have a spare room? That's always brilliant if they've got a spare room, because you can sort of tidy things away, out of the way, keeping areas safe and clear, but they haven't actually had to have the emotional letting go of anything. So attic spaces, spare rooms, shared garden sheds, garages, if they're not already full, because sometimes they are, that is a great place to start, because you're not asking them to get rid of anything. So that's a good place.
Early intervention is the key.
Yeah, definitely.
As with most things, I think, is if we can have those conversations, but I think people feel very uncomfortable. People don't want to be intrusive, but I think actually having a very gentle conversation at that point is really, really important before, like you said, it gets to the point where there's a social services referral. And somebody like yourself is called in to clear that, because that is far more traumatic than trying to manage the situation early on. Do you do private work as well? So you don't have to have a social services referral to get involved with pocket markets?
Yeah, we get quite a lot of private work. Our work comes from all over, so sometimes people do refer themselves. That's quite rare. We have had it. It's much easier if they refer themselves, because they're fully on board. They've had enough. They've realised that they're ready to make the changes, and then the process for us is so much easier because they are prepared to get rid of things. Sometimes it's the family that come to us, and we have to negotiate a little bit with the person. Sometimes, unfortunately, the person's already passed away and the family have been left to deal with the house, which is always a really sad situation. Quite often the family is shocked because they didn't know how bad it had got. It's so common that they're like, oh, we haven't been allowed in for years. One case I did, the daughter who sort of spoke to us, she was taking her mum weekly shopping every week, but she was making her leave it on the doorstep. The mum wouldn't let her in. So it's just so hard. And then she was so devastated by the severity of what it had become. But for us, again, those houses are easier because the family just want it cleared. They just want it cleaned, made safe, that you're not having the emotional battle with somebody, or, oh, we're allowed to get rid of this Christmas card from 1982, sort of back and forth. That is,
I can imagine a chief negotiator as well is part of the role. You've brought us to a really, really interesting point, because and you and I have had a conversation about this previously, is around people's possessions. So part of our channel, what we hear a lot is, I've been left to deal with mum and dad's stuff. Generally it's the parent stuff. They were so attached to all of these things, and I feel terrible now just wanting to get a skip and throw it all away. We've talked about Swedish death cleaning, which is, there's a whole book, and I think both you and I are sort of looking into that and seeing the sort of principles of it. I think the message is this things that we can do? Because a lot of what we hear from people is, I don't want to put my kids in the position that my parents have left me in, with having to deal with all my stuff. So have you got any thoughts on that?
So again, it's sort of getting involved and sort of thinking about it before it gets too much. My own mum's actually just gone through the process of Swedish death cleaning. She's only 72. I'm hoping she's not going anywhere for a very long time. But my stepdad passed away 18 months ago, and I think that gave her a bit of a sort of realization. She's not immortal, and bless her, she has spent the last 18 months clearing out the attic, decluttering. She's decorated every room. She's had the front of the house painted. She is fully preparing to make our lives easier. We haven't asked her to or anything. We would have obviously happily sorted that all out. But like you say, as parents, you don't necessarily want your children to have to deal with it. So if you're in the position where you think, oh, I've got a lot of clutter, or I could really do with sorting out the house because my kids are going to have to deal with it. Again, start small, start with a corner. If you can't deal with the whole room, start with a shelf, a drawer, a cupboard, little and often, do a little bit, fill one black bag a day. Even my own house, I like to think that I'm quite clean and tidy, but if I start opening my drawers and my cupboards, I could have a massive declutter. I think everybody could, really. And just little by little, like whatever you're comfortable with. Some things are precious and they might not be valuable in money, but they'd have sentimental value. Nobody's asking you to throw away your family heirlooms. But if you have got Christmas cards from 20 years ago, or newspapers from the Silver Jubilee, is it now time to have a think about having a bit of a clear out, a little bit of a sort out? How much does that mean to you? Because what's it going to mean to your kids? Are they going to put it in the recycling? They probably are. Do you know what I mean? So
they absolutely are. And I think as well, it's that guilt people is, I feel guilty about getting rid of this, but actually looking at the things that I've got, is I know that some things will mean something to me, but they absolutely won't have any meaning to anybody else on the planet. So it's kind of almost accepting that they're mine now, but at some point I'm gonna have to let them go, because I don't really want anybody else dealing with them, or labeling things to say, that once, if anything happens, that can go to the charity shop, or this, I would prefer this to go to somebody. Any sort of final thoughts on how could people get hold of you? We're going to put all your details in our show notes, so if somebody does want to book a clean, or they have any concerns, they can contact you directly, or if you're quite far away, you can always put in a referral to social services if you have concerns about perhaps a neighbour, because there may be more issues. I'm sure you find that hoarding on its own doesn't come as an isolated challenge, shall we say, and there was definitely other things going on for that person. So if you are worried, what would you say to anyone?
So I always say, so it's really it's so like difficult to report someone on social services. Like nobody wants to do that. However, the way that I see, if you genuinely think that somebody's safety is a concern, you've got a moral obligation, whether they want, help or not. If they, God forbid, got crushed to death in their own house and got found a month later because nobody had intervened, would you be able to live with yourself? Because that is the reality, and that is so common. And it can do these referrals anonymously. I mean, I say you can get in touch with me, but coming directly to me, unless you are the person who's asking for the clean, we are always going to have to involve the person. If it's a safety issue, adult social services is a great place to start. They will probably get the fire brigade to go and do an assessment. Quite often when, like you said earlier, if people think that safety is a concern, you saying to your mum, it's not safe in here, you've got to get rid of everything, they're not going to listen, they don't want to know, your opinion doesn't matter. But if the local fireman comes round and says, actually, this is a very unsafe environment, they are much more likely to listen. So take the pressure off yourselves and let somebody else take control of the situation. There are lots of support sort of services, and there are hoarding services as well, hoarding charities. Google hoarding charities, there's 3 or 4 amazing ones that will advise as well.
Fantastic. I think as well, what's important to note is if you make a referral to adult social care, is just because somebody's house is messy, it does not mean they're going to go in and start making demands. It is very much around how bad it is, and what you might consider messy might not. It might be messy, but that's okay for people to live like that. And they won't start doing things unless it becomes a really, is it very much a safety concern for their well-being. Definitely. So they're not going to go in and start forcing people to do things. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's very fascinating, and we'll see you on another episode to talk about the unattended death cleans.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Take care.